1 million Americans have now officially died of COVID. That number seems impossibly large, so let's try to put it in perspective. That's more Americans than died during the Civil War. It's more people that died than in the 1918 pandemic, and that was before we had the benefits of modern medicine, let alone warp-speed vaccines. When America neared 100,000 dead from COVID in May of 2020, the New York Times pronounced it an incalculable loss. But now we've grown numb. There's still a lot we don't know about this evolving virus, but here's what we do know. America's COVID death toll did not need to be this high. We know that because Dr. Deborah Birx, the COVID response coordinator under ex-President Trump, told us.
The first time we have an excuse, but there were about 100,000 deaths that came from that original surge. All of the rest of them, in my mind, could have been mitigated or decreased substantially if we took the lessons we had learned from that moment and ensured we utilized them.
Instead, we politicized the pandemic, turning masks and vaccines into culture war signifiers. Now, Trump shifted from denial to downplaying the disease to hawking quack cures. He got COVID, then hid the fact that he got the vaccine for months. And his mouthpieces on right-wing talk TV kept reinforcing the message. COVID was overblown, or hoax, or conspiracy, and vaccines were a plot to take away freedom rather than save lives.
What about the efficacy of the vaccine itself among adults?
It's almost this apartheid-style open-air hostage situation.
The science shows the vaccine will not necessarily protect you. It's not protecting many people.
There's nothing more anti-democratic, anti-freedom than pushing an experimental drug on Americans against their will.
Now we can't deny that there's a real-world cost to all those lies. COVID demonstrated that disinformation and misinformation can be deadly. Don't believe me? Well, let's dig into the data. In the early days of the pandemic, deaths were concentrated in urban areas, primarily in blue states around the Northeast, as this graph from Pew shows. There were, of course, no vaccines available. But by that fall, death rates in more rural red counties leapt ahead. Now, you can see the sharp drop-off when vaccines became more widely available in February and March of 2021. But by that point, some 500,000 people in America had already died of COVID. But vaccine resistance was already dividing us along partisan lines. And when the next wave hit in the late summer of 2021, you could see that vast majority of deaths came from counties that voted most heavily for Donald Trump. That's because those counties had much lower levels of vaccination. Here's a devastating stat. During the Delta wave in the fall of 21, death rates in low vaccination counties were about 6 times as high compared to counties where 70% or more people were vaccinated. And in February of this year, according to the CDC, unvaccinated people 12 and up were 20 times more likely to die of COVID than people who were both vaxxed and boosted. And then there's this. KFF calculating that through March, at least 234,000 U.S. COVID deaths could have been preventable just through primary vaccination. Each of these is their own story. But many were victims of disinformation and misinformation at some level, swayed by fear-fueled partisan lies about vaccination. And they paid for it with their own lives. That's a surreal tragedy. And it's not over yet, because even after 1 million dead, 37% of Republicans still say they definitely won't get vaccinated, compared to 15% of independents and just 3% of Democrats, according to KFF. And while the Senate fights over whether to pay for a new round of vaccines and boosters, we see a state like Missouri try to pass a law that would stop pharmacists from telling their patients that quack cures do not work for COVID, even when they've been clinically debunked. So the war on disinformation continues alongside the war on COVID. They're interrelated. But with 1 million dead here at home, let's at least try to ensure that no more Americans die because of a lie. And that's your reality check.